Today's lecture deals with one theory of government that became popular in the 17th century. That theory was known as absolutism, and it was the dominant system of government among Europe's ruling class for more than 2 centuries. But what was absolutism? Well, in addition to our study of absolutism, there are other names and terms that you should know by the end of this lecture. Moreover, there are several questions you should be able to answer by the end of this lecture as well. So let's get started. Let's begin with a little review. Remember, the 17th century was a time of religious turmoil and intolerance. The Reformation, which had occurred 100 years before, created a devastating divide in the Christian church. This divide led to numerous wars, the most serious of which was the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War, which was fought from 1618 to 1648, was one of the most brutal conflicts in the history of Western civilization. Between 3 million and 11 million people died in a war that was in many ways an extension of the Reformation. Basically, it was a war between Catholic nations and Protestant nations. Nevertheless, one of the most long-lasting legacies of the war had nothing to do with religion. Instead, it was connected to an increase in the power of the government. Specifically, it dealt with an increase in the power of the king. Why? One reason has to do with the nature of war itself. Wars are expensive, and to fight them, rulers often have to pay taxes. This is what happened during the 30 Years' War, as rulers across Europe imposed one new tax after another on their people. Now, these taxes went to pay for soldiers and supplies and weapons. Now, many of the people in Europe didn't like paying these taxes, and they revolted against their governments. However, the war also led each kingdom to create an enormous army. Remember, those taxes were going to pay for a new military. They were going to pay for, as I just said, soldiers and supplies and weapons. And when these armies were not fighting the foreign enemy, they could be turned upon their own people. And so these armies helped strengthen the power of the king. They helped strengthen the power of the central government. Finally, the 30 Years' War resulted in a decline in church power. Not only did the Catholic nations fail to destroy Protestantism again, but when the peace settlement for the war was being negotiated, the Pope was not consulted. This was a real insult to his authority, and it showed that the church was losing its power to influence politics. This increase in the power of the state led to the development of a new theory of government. That new theory was known as absolutism, and it will be the dominant form of government for the next 200 years. But what is absolutism? Well, let's look at our textbook. According to that textbook, absolutism is defined as, quote, a system of government in which the ruler claims sole and uncontestable power, end quote. Basically, what that means is really what it sounds like. Specifically, it means the absolute authority to make laws, to tax the people, to administer justice, and to determine foreign policy. By absolute authority, we mean that no one could interfere with the king's power to do these things. If he wanted to raise taxes, he did so without interference from a Congress or a parliament. If he wanted to go to war or to make peace, he did so. The king's word was law. Absolutism will be the dominant form of government in 4 of Europe's greatest powers: France, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. However, we are going to focus on what is typically considered to be the best model of absolutism in the 17th century. That, of course, is France. Through a study of absolutist France, we can get a better idea of how absolutism worked, or at least a better idea of how it was supposed to work. Now, the origins of French absolutism lie in the 30 Years' War, as we just discussed. But it also lies in a series of rebellions that broke out in France after the war. Those rebellions were known as the Fronde. The Fronde was a rebellion of French nobles against their king, Louis XIV. The rebellions began in 1648. Now, that's the same year that the 30 Years' War ended, not a coincidence. And they lasted until 1652. The nobles were angry with the growing power of the French monarch, and they allied themselves with the peasants, who were angry over those heavy taxes that they had been forced to pay, to pay for the 30 Years' War. The king's government, using the army that he had built to fight the 30 Years' War, crushed the Fronde. They crushed the rebellion. Moreover, King Louis XIV learned a valuable lesson when the Fronde ended. he realized he could not trust the nobility, nor could he trust the people. And so this is going to influence his policy over the rest of his reign, for the most part. In fact, Louis XIV will become the embodiment of absolutism. In some respects, Louis XIV will invent absolutism, and it's a way to control the nobility, a way to control the people. Now, Louis will rule from 1643 until 1715. And a big part of absolutism, at least Louis's absolutism, has to do with symbolism. Louis liked to make himself the very symbol of the French people. He liked to make himself a symbol of power, a symbol of authority, a symbol of absolute, unchallenged power. And so he did this in a number of ways. One of which was by giving himself a number of names, the most popular of which was the Sun King. He liked to argue that he was the source of light for the French people. At other times, he will declare l'état c'est moi, which simply means I am the state. In other words, basically what Louis says is law. Whatever Louis wants is the law of the land. L'état c'est moi, I am the state. But Louis doesn't stop there. He claims that his authority to govern with absolute authority came from God. In other words, God made Louis king, and therefore no one had the right to resist his power. This will become known as the divine right of kings. In other words, Louis is claiming that the king gets his power from God, or the divine. The divine right of kings is going to have a lot to do with creating this idea that you cannot challenge the king. Another chief symbol of Louis's power was his palace at Versailles. Now, when Louis became king, Versailles was a tiny village just 12 miles outside of Paris. Now, Louis is going to decide to make Versailles his new capital by building the most ornate palace the world has ever seen. It was completed in the year 1685. Versailles was the most opulent and ornate palace in all of Europe. It was renowned for its use of gold and mirrors, and its gardens were thought to be the finest in the world. Here is another picture of Versailles today, and again, you can see how grand this must have been, how awe-inspiring it must have been for any visitor coming to see the king. And that was the point, trying to inspire awe in the king's power and his authority. Excuse me. But Versailles was more than just a pretty place to live. In fact, it was an important tool in Louis XIV's push for absolute power. So how did Louis use Versailles to further his power? First, the extravagance of the palace immediately made Louis the envy of every monarch in Europe. Because it was such a grand palace, 50,000 people, many of them important military officers, government advisors, and members of the nobility, moved to Versailles to live with him. He made such a grand palace that everyone wanted to live there. Everyone wanted to be there with the king. Now think about that. This is very clever on Louis's part, because what Louis is doing is he's bringing the most powerful people to live with him at his palace at Versailles. That means that Louis is going to be able to keep an eye on these people at all times. They are not going to be free to scheme against him as easily as they would have been had they been living, hundreds if not thousands of miles from Paris. Very clever on his part. These supposedly powerful individuals will also vie with one another to win the attention of the king. So, in addition to bringing these powerful people close to him, Louis is also going to manipulate them. He is going to convince them that the most important thing in their life is to become close to the king, to become a close friend or confidant of the king. And he's going to get these people to actually compete with one another for the privilege of helping him dress in the morning, or the privilege of sitting near him at dinner, or the privilege of going on a carriage ride with him. This is what they're going to spend their time doing instead of scheming against him. Again, very clever on his part. Here is a description of a typical day at Versailles. Sire, it is time. The first valet de chambre awakens the king. The first levee begins. Doctors, familiars, and a few favorites will enjoy the privilege of the grand entries, followed in succession into the bedchamber of the king, who is washed, combed, and shaved every other day. the officers of the chamber, and the wardrobe then entered for the grand levee, during which the king was dressed and breakfasted on a bowl of broth. Only the most important personalities in the kingdom were admitted to observe this ritual. The number of attendants is estimated at around 100, all male. So in other words, 100 people will help Louis get out of bed in the morning and get him dressed, and will sit and watch him eat his breakfast. This was thought to be a privilege for which powerful people in France would compete for that privilege. It's insane. Now there is a method to Louis's madness, and it's a method that the Duc de Saint-Simon understood. He understood that when Louis got the nobles interested in life at Versailles, they didn't have time to scheme against him. As the Duc de Saint-Simon writes, motives of policy had something to do with this. By making expensive habits the fashion, and for people in a certain position a necessity, he compelled his courtiers to live beyond their income, and gradually reduced them to depend on his bounty for the means of subsistence. This was a plague which, once introduced, became a scourge to the whole country. For it did not take long to spread to Paris, and thence to the armies and the provinces, so that a man of any position is now estimated entirely according to his expenditure on his table and other luxuries. Again, very, very clever on Louis's part, because think about it. What he's getting these nobles and these military officers to do is to spend their money on things, spend their money on carriages and furniture and artwork and all sorts of things. So they're spending their money on this stuff. They are living outside their means. They can't afford to pay for armies to fight revolts against him. Again, very clever on Louis's part. Versailles was just one example of the king's power, however. Louis was also able to rule without any interference from parliaments or legislative assemblies. France had such an assembly, the Estates General, which had traditionally met to approve new taxes or new laws proposed by the king. The Estates General only met, however, when the king called them into session. Louis's father, Louis XIII, had found working with them troublesome, so he did not call for a meeting of the Estates General after 1614. Louis XIV would rule without them entirely, as would his successor, Louis XV. In fact, the Estates General would not meet again until 1789, a fateful year. Keep that year in mind later on. The king's version of absolutism will also extend to religion. As I said earlier, Louis believed that God himself had made him king. Thus, he believed that as God's representative on earth, he had an obligation to bring his people to the, quote, one true faith, end quote. And for Louis, that was Catholicism. By the 1660s, he had begun to crack down on those who deviated from official Catholic doctrine. The height of this effort came in 1685, when he issued the Edict of Fontainebleau. Now, the Edict of Fontainebleau revoked the Edict of Nantes, which had been issued by his grandfather, Henry of Navarre. Now remember, the Edict of Nantes had ended France's religious civil war 100 years earlier by granting religious toleration to Protestants within France. Louis, however, will argue that the Edict of Nantes was never meant to be a permanent fix. Instead, he believed that God wanted him to return France to Catholicism. Thus, he closed Protestant schools and churches. Hundreds of thousands of French Protestants will flee the country. Others will convert to Catholicism. So in conclusion, what have we learned? In addition to being a time of religious intolerance, the 1600s was also a time of growing state power. Kings and queens were asserting greater and greater power over their lands, their people, and even over the church itself. Nor was this development unique to France. While Louis XIV was the most powerful of the absolute monarchs, he wasn't the only one. Kings and queens in Prussia, Austria, and Russia tried to copy Louis as they extended greater and greater power over their people. However, one great power is missing from this list: England. That is because English kings in the 1600s failed in their efforts to create an absolutist state. Instead, the English model of government is going to have a huge impact that will extend beyond England and all the way to its American colonies. However, that is a story for a future lecture.